I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I would love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. It is always fascinating to see how far our voice travels into the quiet hours of your evening. Let the sound of the rain carry the weight of the day away as we begin. In this video, we will explore a narrative that is as difficult as it is quiet. On February 12th, 2025, we will look into the events of a February evening in Durham, North Carolina, not to find shock, but to understand a tragedy born of a mental health crisis, and to find the small, flickering light of a father's hope. Please get comfortable, close your eyes, and relax. Let the darkness of the screen be a blanket as we dive into tonight's case. Peace is a fragile thing. It breaks without warning. We often mistake the absence of noise for the presence of safety. Tonight, we travel to the quiet, tree-lined streets of Durham, North Carolina, where the winter air hangs heavy with the scent of damp pine and the promise of a coming spring. In mid-February, the landscape of North Carolina exists in a state of transition. The Bermuda grass lies dormant and golden, while the skeletal oak trees reach toward a sky that often turns a deep, bruised purple as the sun begins to set. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a suburban street just as the dusk arrives. It is a silence that feels like a promise of safety. Neighbors recognize the familiar hum of each other's cars, and the amber glow of kitchen windows suggests the warmth of families settling in for the night. Durham is a place of history and soft edges, a city where the residential streets often feel like a sanctuary from the bustle of the waking world. On these streets, the concept of home is held sacred. We lock our doors to keep the outside world at bay, trusting that the four walls around us will act as a container for our peace. But sometimes, the storms we face do not come from the horizon. Sometimes, they gather slowly within the very places we feel most secure. To understand what happened in one such home, we must look past the well-kept lawns and the quiet facades. We must recognize that behind every door, there are battles fought in silence that the neighbors may never see. The date was Thursday, February 12th. It was approximately 5:30 in the evening, a time when the rhythm of the day usually begins to slow down. For most families in the neighborhood, this was a time for preparing dinner or returning from the final errands of the workday. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker to life, casting long, soft shadows across the pavement. But at one particular residence, the mundane routine of a Thursday was about to be shattered by an emergency response that no one expected. At 5:30 p.m., the world was continuing its usual rotation, unaware that inside one Durham home, the air had suddenly grown very still. The Durham police received a dispatch call that offered very little in the way of initial detail. Officers were sent to the house following a report of unresponsive children. The word unresponsive is a clinical term, a heavy and hollow label used by dispatchers and medical professionals to describe a state of being that defies the natural energy of childhood. It is a word that masks a deep, human tragedy beneath a layer of procedural calm. As the flashing lights of the patrol cars cut through the gathering gloom of the evening, the first layers of a complex story began to peel away. The neighbors watched from their windows, seeing the familiar blue and red lights reflecting off the damp asphalt, wondering how a Thursday evening could turn so cold so quickly. The house itself looked no different than the ones flanking it. It was a standard family home, a place where toys might usually be scattered on the floor and the sounds of laughter might carry through the walls. But as the officers crossed the threshold, they were met with a reality that stood in stark contrast to the peaceful exterior. Inside, they found two young children, both under the age of 5. At that age, life is supposed to be defined by movement, by growth, and by the constant discovery of the world. To find such young lives in a state of stillness is a weight that stays with those who witness it. The arrival of the police marked the end of the world, as the Faust family knew it, while the rest of the neighborhood continued with their evening plans. The machinery of emergency medicine and law enforcement began to move with a somber urgency. There were no raised voices heard from the street, no outward signs of a struggle that had spilled onto the sidewalk. There was only the arrival of the ambulances and the quiet, focused movements of first responders. It was a transition from a mundane afternoon to a life-altering crisis, occurring in the span of a few heartbeats. As we move further into this evening, we begin to see that the events inside the home were not the result of a sudden intrusion from the outside, but the culmination of a struggle that had been building in the shadows of the mind. The silence of the house was not a sign of peace, but a sign that a breaking point had finally been reached. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. I am glad you are here. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. It is always fascinating to see how far our voice travels in the quiet hours. Let the sound of the rain carry the weight of the day away as we begin this journey together into the heart of a quiet North Carolina evening. In this video, we will explore a narrative that is as difficult as it is quiet. We will look into the events of a February evening in Durham, not to find shock, but to understand a tragedy born of a mental health crisis, and to find the small, flickering light of a father's hope in the city of Durham. Durham is a place where the trees stand tall, and the air often carries the scent of damp pine needles and wet earth. In the transition from late winter to early spring, the days are short, and the nights arrive with a heavy, cool stillness. At 5:30 in the evening, the sky often turns a deep, bruised purple, reflecting off the windows of quiet residential homes. These are the kinds of streets where neighbors recognize each other's cars, and the sound of a distant closing car door is the only thing that breaks the peace. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a suburban street just as the sun begins to set. It is a silence that feels like a promise of safety. We tend to view our homes as sanctuaries, as places where the walls are thick enough to keep the storms of the world at bay. But sometimes, the most difficult storms are the ones that form from within, invisible to the neighbors passing by on the sidewalk. At the time, the neighborhood was settling into the usual patterns of a Thursday evening, unaware that the suburban promise of safety was about to be tested. As the streetlights began to hum in the cold air, the usual rhythm was interrupted by a reality that would leave a community searching for answers. The dormant Bermuda grass was silver with frost, and the skeletal oak trees reached toward the darkening sky, standing as silent witnesses to a family's deepest struggle. This was a neighborhood where the fences were low and the trust was high, a community woven together by generations of shared summers and harsh winters. Here, the hum of the heater and the glow of a single amber window were signs of a day winding down, unaware that for one family, the world was about to change forever. The transition from the warmth of a family living room to the sterile blue-tinged light of an emergency ward happens with a speed that the human mind is rarely equipped to process. As the ambulances pulled away from the quiet street in Durham, the rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights began to fade into the steady, humming glow of the local hospital's trauma center. Inside those walls, the air is different. It is filtered, cold, and carries the faint, sharp scent of antiseptic and floor wax. For the two young brothers, both of whom were under the age of 5, the world had shrunk down to the size of a gurney, and the focused expressions of the medical teams waiting for their arrival. There is a profound and heavy vulnerability in childhood that we often choose to ignore, a fragility that is never more apparent than when a child is described by the clinical term unresponsive. In the medical world, unresponsive is a word used to bridge the gap between hope and the unknown. It is a placeholder for a status that has not yet been defined by recovery or by loss. For the staff at the hospital that evening, the priority was immediate and absolute, a flurry of motion designed to restart what had stopped and to stabilize what was wavering. Both boys, small and silent, became the center of a high-stakes effort where every second was measured by the sweep of a second hand on a wall clock. You have to wonder how the atmosphere in a room changes when the patients are so young. Their small frames dwarfed by the complex machinery of modern medicine, it is a sight that stays with those who witness it, a reminder of how thin the veil truly is between a normal Thursday evening and a life-altering catastrophe. Despite the collective expertise and the desperate pace of the intervention, the night eventually brought a somber clarity to the situation. In the sterile halls of the hospital, the outcome was split between a final goodbye and a desperate hope for recovery. One of the children, a boy whose life was only beginning to gather its own stories and memories, could not be brought back. The announcement of a child's death in a hospital setting creates a specific kind of vacuum, a silence that seems to swallow the surrounding noise of the busy corridors. It is a moment where the clinical facts of a case file collide with the raw, jagged edges of human grief. The machinery that had been humming so urgently was eventually silenced, leaving behind a stillness that felt entirely wrong in a place dedicated to healing. While one room fell into that deep, tragic quiet, the other remained a theater of intense observation and guarded optimism. The surviving brother remained anchored to the world, his condition stable enough to offer a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark narrative. It is a haunting duality for any family to face: the need to mourn a life lost while simultaneously pouring every ounce of energy into the life that remains. How does a father or a community balance those two opposing forces? The fragility of life had been demonstrated in its most painful form, yet the resilience of a young body fighting to recover provided a necessary, albeit heavy, focus for the hours that followed. The hospital waiting room, usually a place of transition, became a station of profound reflection as the night deepened. There is a unique weight to the air in those spaces after midnight, a feeling of being suspended in time while the rest of the world continues to sleep. The news of the tragedy began to ripple outward, moving from the medical staff to the investigators, and eventually to the neighbors who were still standing on their porches back in the suburbs. Every update from the doctors was a piece of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve, a clinical accounting of a trauma that defied simple explanation. The focus remained on the surviving child, whose recovery was described not just as a medical goal, but as a vital necessity for a family that had already lost so much. As the first few hours of the investigation unfolded within the hospital's perimeter, the mechanical nature of the law began to interface with the medical reality. Social workers and officers moved through the halls with hushed voices, their presence a reminder that the tragedy was now a matter of public record and legal scrutiny. The clinical facts, the heart rates, the oxygen levels, the timestamps of arrival were being meticulously documented, forming the foundation of a case that would soon move from the bedside to the courtroom. But for that night, the primary reality remained a human one, centered on a small survivor and the memory of a brother who was no longer there. The silence of the hospital at 3 a.m. is a heavy blanket, one that covers both the deepest sorrows and the most fragile of hopes. The clock on the wall of that silent hospital room ticks forward, but to understand how we arrived at such a sterile, quiet place, we must look back to the late afternoon of February 12th. It was a Thursday in Durham, North Carolina. The neighborhood was quiet. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long amber fingers across the residential streets, where the dormant Bermuda grass lay like a pale carpet under the skeletal oak trees. At 5:30 in the evening, the world was alive with the small, comforting sounds of the day winding down. You might have heard the distant hum of a heater or the muffled clinking of silver against ceramic as families prepared for their evening meals. It was the hour when cars pull into driveways and the smell of damp pine needles hangs heavy in the cooling air, a time when the streetlights begin to hum in the cold. To the families living on this street, the homes are more than just structures. They are sanctuaries, containers of peace that shield the inhabitants from the storms of the outside world. But sometimes, the storm does not come from the horizon. Sometimes it gathers within the very walls meant to provide shelter. On this evening, as the dusk turned the sky a deep, bruised purple, that sense of sanctuary was about to be irrevocably altered. The routine of a mundane Thursday was broken by the sharp, insistent trill of a dispatcher's radio, a sound that carries a weight of its own, signaling the moment when a private struggle becomes a public tragedy. A call had come in from a home that looked much like any other on its block, a standard family residence with a tidy yard and a porch light waiting to be flicked on. The information provided to the responding officers was sparse and clinical, stripped of the emotion that would soon saturate the scene. They were told only that there were unresponsive children inside the house. It is a word that carries a terrible, hollow weight in the world of emergency services, a clinical label that masks a deep human tragedy unfolding in the shadows. Unresponsive suggests a suspension of life, a terrifying stillness where there should be the movement and noise of early childhood. It is a word that stops the heart of anyone who hears it, a signal that the most vulnerable among us are in the gravest of dangers. As the first patrol cars turned onto the street, their tires crunched softly over the grit and fallen leaves of a North Carolina winter. The flashing blue and red lights did not scream. Instead, they pulsed rhythmically, reflecting off the darkened windows of neighboring houses and the bare branches of the trees. At 5:30 p.m., the world was continuing its usual rotation, unaware that inside one Durham home, the air had suddenly grown very still. The neighbors might have looked out from behind their curtains, watching as the shadows of the officers grew long and distorted in the strobe of the emergency lights, wondering why the peace of their evening was being interrupted by the machinery of the law. The transition from a quiet evening to a scene of intense emergency response is often silent at first. There is the clicking of car doors, the low murmur of voices over radios, and the heavy tread of boots on a walkway. Inside that home, the mundane details of daily life, a half-finished cup of water, a toy left on the rug, perhaps a television flickering in a corner, remained exactly as they were, frozen in time. These objects, so ordinary in any other context, now stood as silent witnesses to a reality that had suddenly fractured. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a residential street just as the sun begins to set. It is a silence that feels like a promise of safety. But on this night, that promise had been broken. As the flashing lights of the patrol cars cut through the gathering gloom, the first layers of a complex story began to peel away, revealing a narrative born of a mental health crisis and the fragile threads that hold a family together. In the days following that February evening, the residents of this Durham neighborhood found themselves caught in a state of profound disbelief. To those who shared a fence line or waved from across the street, the woman being described in the news reports felt like a stranger. They knew Andrea Faust not as a defendant, but as an awesome mother, a woman who appeared to be very nice and genuinely caring in every interaction. One neighbor, reflecting on the quiet rhythms of their street, described her as someone who loved her children very much, making the charges brought against her feel entirely unbelievable. There is a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that occurs when a community's collective memory of a person clashes so violently with a legal accusation. They remembered the small, mundane moments of suburban life, the way she moved through her day with a focus on her family, the kindness she offered to those living nearby, and the visible devotion she had for her sons. They saw a woman who was present, who was engaged, and who seemed to embody the very essence of maternal care. The streets in this part of Durham are lined with homes that speak of stability and routine. There are manicured lawns that turn a dormant gold in the winter, and sturdy oak trees that wait for the first signs of spring. The air often carries the faint scent of damp pine needles or the wood smoke from a nearby chimney. In such a setting, the arrival of police cruisers and the yellow tape of a crime scene feels like a tear in the fabric of reality. Neighbors who had previously only discussed the weather or the local schools now stood in small groups, their voices low and heavy with a shared sense of grief. They tried to reconcile the Andrea they knew with the events that had transpired inside her home. They spoke of her as a neighbor who was always ready with a kind word, someone who seemed to navigate the complexities of motherhood with grace and patience. To them, she was a fixture of their daily lives, a person whose character was defined by her warmth rather than her struggles. Yet beneath that surface of normalcy, there were subtle shifts that only became clear in the clarity of hindsight. One observer, who had seen her frequently, noted that Andrea seemed to be under more stress than normal in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, though she never allowed her caring demeanor to slip or her kindness to falter. This observation of stress was not seen as a warning sign at the time, but rather as the common weight that many parents carry in the quiet of their own lives. It is a reminder that the version of ourselves we present to the world is often a carefully maintained sanctuary, even when the foundations are beginning to tremble under an unseen weight. We often think we know the people we see every day, assuming that a friendly greeting at the mailbox or a wave over a garden fence is a complete map of a person's soul. We see the external markers of a life, the car in the driveway, the toys on the porch, the lights in the window, and we assume that they tell the whole story. To those who lived alongside her, Andrea was not a headline. She was the woman who loved her children, the neighbor who offered a kind word, and a part of the quiet peace they all shared. The contrast between her public reputation and the private collapse that occurred is the most haunting aspect of this story. It forces a realization that the people we believe we know best may be fighting internal storms that are invisible to the naked eye. We look at the houses on our own streets and see the lights in the windows, assuming they represent the same warmth we feel in our own homes. We imagine the families inside are settling in for the night, safe and secure. But behind the doors of every home, there are battles fought in silence. Battles that sometimes reach a breaking point before the world outside even knows a war is being waged. The ambulance doors closed on a scene that had moved from a quiet home to a race against time. Inside the pressurized cabin of the emergency vehicle, medical technicians worked with a focused, rhythmic intensity, their hands moving through a sequence of life-saving measures that had been practiced 1,000 times before. Both children were under the age of 5, a time of life defined by an inherent and profound vulnerability that makes any medical crisis feel especially heavy. At this age, the world is still small, and the safety of a parent is the only law a child truly knows. The journey to the hospital was a blur of blue lights reflecting off the damp pavement of the Durham streets. Upon arrival, the quiet of the North Carolina evening was replaced by the bright, fluorescent hum of the emergency department. The air here was different, carrying the sharp scent of antiseptic and the low, constant vibration of machinery, designed to keep the rhythm of life moving when the body falters. Doctors and nurses stepped into the gap, their movements efficient and devoid of the panic that would surely overwhelm anyone else in such a moment. They worked in a space where every second is measured, where the distance between a heartbeat and silence is often thinner than a sheet of paper. In the sterile halls of the hospital, the outcome was split between a final goodbye and a desperate hope for recovery. Despite the collective efforts of the trauma team, the news that eventually filtered out into the waiting area was a mixture of profound grief and guarded relief. One of the brothers had passed away, his journey ending in the very place meant to provide a new beginning. The other child remained, his condition critical but stable. A small spark of life that the medical staff fought to keep from flickering out. He was expected to survive, a fact that offered the only solace in a night otherwise defined by shadow. The atmosphere in the hospital became one of somber reflection as the immediate urgency of the medical intervention began to fade into the long, slow process of observation. Staff moved with lowered voices, a sign of respect for a family that had been fundamentally altered within the span of a single hour. It was a moment where the clinical met the emotional, and the weight of the tragedy began to settle into the records. With the loss confirmed, the machinery of the law began to turn, seeking answers for an act that defied explanation. The formal documents were processed with a heavy, rhythmic clicking of keys in the Durham County Clerk's office. These papers transformed a neighborhood tragedy into a state matter, labeling the events with the highest severity possible under the law. Andrea Faust now faced 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. These are not merely charges. They are the legal echoes of a shattered home. Each word in the filing carried the weight of a child's life and the fragile survival of another. As the morning of February 16th dawned, the expected movement of the legal system hit an unexpected hurdle. Usually, the first appearance is a brisk, procedural event held within the stark confines of the courthouse. But on this Friday, the defendant was not present in the room. The usual sounds of a courtroom, the shuffling of papers and the low murmur of attorneys, were met with a conspicuous silence where Andrea should have been. Her absence was not a choice, but a medical necessity. It soon became clear that the crisis within the Faust home had not ended when the police arrived. Following the events of that Thursday evening, Andrea had attempted to harm herself while in custody. This revelation shifted the focus from a purely criminal inquiry to one of profound psychological distress. It suggested a mind that had completely fractured, leaving a woman who was physically present but mentally adrift in a sea of trauma. The self-inflicted wounds served as a grim testament to the internal storm that Eric Faust would later describe as a total mental health crisis. The courtroom was ready, but the defendant was in a hospital bed, a reminder that some wounds are not visible to the eye. This physical separation between the law and the accused created a strange, disconnected atmosphere. While the judge prepared to read the charges, Andrea was surrounded by the antiseptic smell of the hospital and the rhythmic pulse of medical equipment. There is a specific kind of stillness in a high-security hospital room, a silence enforced by both medicine and the law. When the hearing finally took place, it would not be a standard proceeding, but a window into a family's deepest pain. The court clerk initiated the connection, and the silence of the room was replaced by the low-frequency hum of a digital link. On the large monitors mounted to the courtroom walls, the grainy image of a hospital room flickered into view. It was a stark contrast to the heavy, dark wood and the formal architecture of the Durham justice system. Instead of a wooden bench or a steel chair, the defendant was framed by the sterile whites and pale blues of a medical ward. Andrea was not standing before a judge in a traditional sense. She was lying in a bed, her frame appearing small and fragile against the clinical backdrop of monitors and IV poles. The lag in the video created a strange, ghostly effect where her movements seemed to trail behind the reality of the moment. This digital disconnect served as a metaphor for the entire situation, a barrier that made the proceedings feel both intimate and impossibly distant. There is a specific coldness to a Zoom hearing, where the weight of a first-degree murder charge is delivered through a speaker that crackles with static. The technology, designed for efficiency, struggled to contain the sheer magnitude of the human grief present in that virtual space. Every few seconds, the image would stutter, freezing the defendant's expression in a moment of profound, hollow exhaustion. The courtroom itself felt overly large and hollow during the transition. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale light that pierced the high windows, settling on the polished surfaces of empty benches. The rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys was the only consistent sound, a mechanical pulse that measured the passing of minutes. Outside, the North Carolina sky was a bruised purple, the light of the late afternoon fading into a somber gray that matched the mood inside. The blue light from the monitors cast an unnatural glow over the proceedings, washing out the natural colors of the room and making the faces of the attorneys look pale and tired. Standing within the courtroom, physically present while his wife remained confined to her hospital bed, was Andrea Faust. He stood in the narrow gap between the rigid requirements of the law and the fragile reality of his family. His presence provided a human anchor in a room dominated by procedural checklists and legal jargon. He wore the expression of a man who had not slept in days, his shoulders heavy with a weight that no legal verdict could ever truly lift. While the judge and the attorneys discussed the logistics of the case, the visual of a mother in a hospital bed remained the central, haunting focal point of the screen. Through a screen, the distance between the legal system and the human heart felt wider than ever. The clinical environment surrounding Andrea reminded everyone that this was not merely a legal matter, but a total psychological collapse. There was no gavel strike that could pierce the fog of the medical ward, and no legal argument that could bridge the physical separation between the courtroom and the hospital. The silence that followed the judge's opening remarks was long and heavy, filled only by the distant, muffled sounds of hospital corridors leaking through the microphone. According to those present, the visual of the pixelated hospital gown and the stark white walls created a sense of profound melancholy. There was no sense of confrontation, only a quiet, shared recognition of a tragedy that had no easy answers. The legal machinery continued to turn, but it felt secondary to the raw human suffering displayed on the monitors. It was in this digital space, amidst the hum of electronics and the sterile atmosphere of the law, that Andrea Faust chose to speak. He moved toward the microphone with a slow, deliberate step, preparing to address the court and his wife not as a witness for the state, but as a husband trying to reach across an unthinkable void. Eric leaned toward the microphone, his shadow stretching long across the polished wood of the courtroom floor. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. On the screen, the image of his wife remained still, a pale figure against the stark white of hospital linens. He took a breath, and when he spoke, His voice was not filled with the sharp edges of accusation or the weight of anger. Instead, it carried a softness that seemed to settle over the proceedings like a heavy blanket. He looked directly at the camera, trying to bridge the miles of fiber optic cable and the sterile walls of the medical ward. He told her that he was begging her, asking her with every ounce of strength he had left to stop trying to harm herself. The words were simple, yet they held the gravity of a man standing at the edge of a cliff. He promised her that if she worked with her doctors, if she allowed the healing process to begin, he would be there to bridge the gap. He committed himself to a difficult task, promising to give her updates on their surviving son as often as he possibly could. It was a deal struck in the shadow of a great loss, a tether offered to a woman who seemed to be drifting away into a dark sea of her own making. In that moment, the legal charges and the police reports seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the raw, unvarnished reality of a family trying to survive a storm. He spoke of Andrea not as the woman in the headlines, but as the person he had known for years. He insisted to the court, and to anyone listening, that this was a complete mental health crisis. He described her as a tremendous mother, a woman whose true nature was defined by care and devotion rather than the events of that February evening. To Eric, the actions that had led them to this courtroom were not the actions of his wife, but the symptoms of a total psychological collapse. He spoke with a desperate, pleading kindness, building a bridge of words over a chasm of grief that most people could not begin to imagine. The courtroom remained hushed as he continued, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the wood, his knuckles pale. He was a man who had lost a child and nearly lost another, yet his primary concern in this digital space was the survival of the woman who had been at the center of it all. It was a display of unconditional love that felt almost out of place in the cold, procedural environment of a first appearance hearing. The flickering light of the monitor cast a blue hue over his face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and the deep-seated sorrow in his eyes. He did not raise his voice, nor did he demand answers that might not yet exist. He simply spoke his truth, offering a perspective that challenged the clinical narrative of the prosecution. He wanted the world to understand that the woman in the hospital bed was a person in need of help, not just a defendant in a murder trial. As his address drew to a close, the weight of his words seemed to linger in the air, a testament to the complexity of the human heart when faced with the unthinkable. His message was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a capacity for grace that defies logic. He had seen the worst of what a mental health crisis could do, yet he stood there offering a path forward. The hearing was a legal necessity, a cog in the machinery of justice. But Eric's plea turned it into something far more intimate. It was a private conversation held in a public forum, a husband reaching out to a wife who was lost in a fog of her own mind. As he stepped back from the microphone, the silence returned, heavier than before. The judge, the attorneys, and the observers sat in the stillness of the afternoon, processing the raw emotion that had just filled the room. Eric's words were not just for the woman on the screen. They were a message to anyone listening to the news that evening. A call to look closer at the hidden battles people fight every day. The transition from the courtroom to the world outside was beginning, and the story was about to move from a private plea to a public warning. As the echoes of the courtroom began to fade into the digital hum of the recording, the weight of the moment shifted from the legal to the communal. Andrea Faust's words did not stay within the sterile confines of the virtual hearing. They moved outward, traveling through the evening air of Durham like a somber frequency. At the time, the public was still reeling from the initial reports of the tragedy, trying to reconcile the image of a quiet suburban home with the news of a child's death. But Eric provided a different lens through which to view the darkness. He spoke with a rhythmic, steady conviction, turning his personal agony into a philosophical mirror for everyone watching. It was a moment of profound altruism, where a man whose world had just been shattered reached out to ensure that others might avoid a similar fate. He urged the world to take a moment and assess where they were mentally. It was a simple request, yet in the context of a murder charge, it carried a staggering weight. According to those who heard him that day, his voice held no traces of the jagged anger one might expect. Instead, it held the authority of someone who had seen the bottom of a chasm and wanted to warn those walking near the edge. He was describing a mental health crisis not as a choice or a character flaw, but as a catastrophic event, something akin to a natural disaster that strikes without the benefit of a siren. He spoke of the importance of checking on family members, of looking past the surface of "I'm fine" to see the exhaustion or the fracturing happening beneath. In the quiet hours of that February evening, his plea felt like a heavy, humid atmosphere settling over the city. He was adamant that the actions the world was judging were not the actions of his wife. This defense of Andrea's character was perhaps the most difficult part for the public to process. He reminded everyone that anyone who knew her would describe her as a tremendous mother, a woman who was caring and devoted. He was presenting a reality where two things could be true at once. A terrible act had occurred, and the person responsible was someone who had spent a lifetime being the opposite of that act. This is the impossible reality of a psychological collapse, where the person's history is suddenly and violently disconnected from their present. The crisis, as Eric described it, was like a slow-moving weather system. It builds quietly, unnoticed by the neighbors or even those within the house, until the barometric pressure reaches a breaking point. It is the dampness in the air before a storm, the way the sky turns a bruised, deep purple just before the first strike of lightning. He was asking the world to become meteorologists of the human soul, to notice the subtle shifts in the wind before the storm levels the home. In the midst of his own world ending, he stopped to ask the rest of us if we were truly all right. He transformed a headline into a humanitarian warning, a plea for families to make sure that everyone is okay before the silence becomes permanent. The community of Durham listened as the rain continued to fall against the window panes of 1,000 homes, blurring the street lights into soft, amber glows. His message was a call to look closer at the hidden battles fought behind closed doors, the struggles that are often masked by the mundane routines of suburban life. He was providing a service to the listeners, a reminder that peace is fragile and that mental health is the foundation upon which all safety is built. As his statement concluded, a profound stillness returned to the courtroom space. The human element had been laid bare, and the tragedy had been framed not as a crime of malice, but as a failure of a mind under too much pressure. While the public processed his words, the legal system had to make a cold, necessary decision. The weight of Eric's words seemed to hang in the digital air long after he had finished speaking, a lingering echo of a husband's devotion. It was then that the Durham County judge turned to the formal requirements of the law, setting aside the raw emotion of the family to establish the next steps of a long and difficult journey. In the quiet atmosphere of the court, where the rhythmic clicking of keys and the soft rustle of papers were the only sounds, the decision regarding Andrea's immediate future was delivered with a steady, clinical precision. The request for bond was denied, ensuring that she would remain in custody as the legal process began its slow and inevitable rotation. This was not merely a matter of criminal procedure, but a decision rooted in the safety of both the community and Andrea herself, given the profound fragility of her current state. This monotone journey through the legal system often feels cold and detached, but here, the judge included a specific mandate that acknowledged the human suffering at the center of the case. The court ordered that Andrea receive immediate and ongoing mental health services while she remained in custody, a recognition that the crisis was far from over. It was a moment where the law seemed to pause, looking past the charges to the person beneath them. Justice in this case began not with a punishment, but with a mandate for healing. The machinery of the state had acknowledged that the woman in the hospital bed was not just a defendant, but a patient in the midst of a total psychological collapse. The calendar was marked for March 3rd, a date that sat on the horizon like a distant shore. It provided a long wait, a period of silence where the noise of the headlines might fade and the work of recovery could begin in earnest. As the virtual session ended and the screens flickered into darkness, the heavy iron gates of the legal system seemed to close with a muffled, final sound, leaving the hallway in a state of somber reflection. The courtroom lights were turned off, the heavy wooden doors were locked, and the focus shifted back to the one small life that remained. The medical reports eventually brought a small, flickering light into the darkness when they confirmed that the surviving boy was expected to make a full physical recovery. His small body was healing, mending the damage done on that quiet February evening, as the first hints of spring began to stir just beyond the hospital glass. The nurses moved softly through the room, their footsteps muffled by the linoleum as they checked monitors that hummed with a steady, reassuring pulse. For Andrea Faust, this news served as a vital lifeline, a singular reason to keep standing when the ground beneath his feet had turned to fragile glass. It meant that while his world had been forever altered, the light had not been entirely extinguished from his home. There was still a voice to hear, a small hand to hold, and a future that required his absolute presence. But this recovery carried a weight that very few people could truly imagine or even begin to describe. It is the impossible reality of a father who must navigate the deepest, most profound grief for one child while providing the highest level of joy and protection for another. He found himself living in two distinct worlds at once, one defined by a permanent, echoing absence, and the other by a miraculous, yet fragile presence. In the quiet moments spent by the hospital bed, the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint, familiar smell of a child's shampoo. He had to learn the difficult art of smiling for the son who remained, even as his heart stayed anchored to the son who was already gone. This is a quiet, lonely kind of strength that never asks for an audience or a headline, but simply exists in the shadows of a suburban bedroom. Moving forward did not mean leaving the tragedy behind, but rather learning how to carry it differently as the cold February days turned into the dampness of March. It meant waking up each morning and choosing to breathe, choosing to walk through a house that felt much too large and much too silent all at once. The surviving brother would grow. He would learn to run through the grass again, and he would eventually ask the kind of questions that have no easy or comfortable answers. One chair will always be empty, but another is being held close as a family learns to breathe again in a different world. They were slowly learning the language of a new life, one where the shadows were long, but the light, however small, was cherished more than ever before. The story of the Faust family is a heavy one, but as we reach the end, we find a place to set that weight down. The streets of Durham are quiet now, the damp pavement reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights like a mirror of the evening's heavy truths. We can imagine the rain as it moves through the neighborhood, a gentle, persistent sound that masks the distant hum of the city and brings a sense of profound stillness to the houses stander in rows. This water does not just wash the dust from the leaves of the oak trees. It serves as a rhythmic reminder that even after the most violent of storms, a calm eventually returns to the earth. We take this moment to step back from the sterile details of the courtroom and the hospital, moving instead into a space of pure, undisturbed reflection. Andrea Faust's plea remains the most enduring part of this narrative, a call to action that extends far beyond the borders of North Carolina. He asked us to look at one another, to truly see the people in our lives, and to ask the questions that are so often left unsaid in the rush of the waking world. It is a reminder that the human mind can be a fragile thing, and that the strength to ask for help is just as vital as the strength required to offer it. We remember the small life that was cut short, a child whose name may be lost to the shifting headlines, but whose presence is felt in the heavy silence of this hour. We also hold space for the brother who remains, a young boy who will grow up in the warmth of a father's unconditional devotion, carrying the hope of a family that refused to let a single night of tragedy be the final word on their lives. As you lie there now, let the weight of the day continue to lift, carried away by the steady, hypnotic rhythm of the rainfall against the glass. You have traveled through a difficult story, but you have done so from a place of absolute safety and deep respect. The air in your room is cool and still, and the world outside is tucked away beneath the soft cover of the night. There is nothing left for you to solve, and there is nothing left for you to carry. The rain continues to fall in Durham, washing over the streets and the houses, bringing a quiet that we can all share. You are safe, you are heard, and for now, you can rest. Let the darkness be a blanket. Sleep now. Good night. The surviving brother is expected to walk out of the hospital into a world that looks exactly the same as the one he left, yet feels entirely different. In the quiet suburbs of Durham, the month of February carries a weight that is unique to the transition of the seasons. A period where the landscape is caught between the deep sleep of winter and the first hesitant stirrings of spring. To understand the stillness that has settled over this neighborhood, one must look closely at the details of the environment that surrounded the Faust home. The grass in this part of North Carolina is largely Bermuda, and in the late winter, it takes on a pale, straw-like hue, lying dormant and brittle against the damp, red clay soil. It is a carpet of muted gold that crunching softly underfoot, waiting for the heat of the sun to return. The trees that line these residential streets are dominated by massive willow oaks and loblolly pines. In February, the oaks are skeletal, their intricate networks of gray branches reaching upward like lace against a sky that is often the color of a weathered stone. When the wind moves through them, it creates a dry, rattling sound, a stark contrast to the soft, evergreen sighing of the pines that stand as silent sentinels in the background. There is a specific architecture to these homes, many of them built with dark red brick and white trim, featuring wide windows that look out onto well-kept lawns and paved driveways. At night, the streetlights cast a soft, amber glow that reflects off the damp pavement, creating long, shimmering ribbons of light that stretch toward the horizon. These lights have a low, rhythmic hum, a frequency that becomes audible only when the rest of the world has gone quiet. It is the sound of the grid, a reminder of the steady, mechanical pulse of the city. On the evening of the incident, the air would have carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys, mixed with the crisp, metallic tang of an approaching rain. This is a landscape designed for peace, for the slow pace of family life and the predictable routines of the workday. The houses are spaced just far enough apart to offer privacy, yet close enough that the sound of a lawnmower or a distant car door closing creates a sense of communal presence. It is within this carefully constructed sanctuary of brick and dormant grass that the unthinkable took place, leaving the neighborhood to grapple with a silence that no longer feels like a promise of safety, but like a heavy, lingering question. As the legal proceedings began to take shape, the traditional atmosphere of the Durham County Courthouse was replaced by the cold, flickering reality of a virtual hearing. The courtroom itself is a place of tradition, defined by heavy, dark wood panels that have absorbed the weight of countless tragedies over the decades. The air there often smells of floor wax and old paper, a scent that suggests the permanence of the law. But on the day Andrea Faust appeared before the judge, the focus was pulled away from the physical room and toward a small, glowing screen. The audio link carried a slight metallic lag, a digital stutter that made the human voice sound distant and fragile. Through the lens of a hospital camera, the world of the court met the world of the clinic. The walls behind Andrea were a stark, clinical white, devoid of any warmth or shadow. It was a space designed for observation and utility, where the soft, rhythmic beeping of medical monitors provided a constant, artificial heartbeat in the background. The visual contrast was jarring. On one side, the judge sat in robes of deep black, framed by the rich mahogany tones of the bench. On the other side, Andrea was seen in a hospital bed, her form draped in a thin cotton gown patterned with small, faded blue shapes. The fabric looked delicate, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the ward. This technology, meant to bridge the distance, instead seemed to amplify the isolation of the moment. Every movement on the screen was slightly pixelated, turning a deeply personal collapse into a series of shifting colors and shapes. When Andrea Faust spoke, his voice was filtered through a microphone that stripped away the lower frequencies, leaving his plea sounding thin and desperate as it echoed through the speakers in the courtroom. He stood in the gap between the rigid requirements of the law and the fluid, chaotic reality of a family in crisis. The sensory experience of the hearing was one of profound disconnect. The warmth of a husband's devotion transmitted through the cold medium of a fiber optic cable, and the weight of a murder charge landing in a room built for healing. To look at this event as a simple sequence of actions is to miss the atmospheric pressure that led to the break. A mental health crisis of this magnitude does not arrive like a sudden explosion. It builds like a weather system, moving slowly and invisibly across the landscape of a person's life. It begins as a subtle shift in the barometric pressure, a heaviness in the air that makes it just a little bit harder to move, to think, or to breathe. It is a gathering of clouds on a distant horizon, so far away that they are easily ignored or mistaken for a passing shadow. But as the system moves closer, the atmosphere begins to change. The light turns a bruised, yellowish purple, and the birds go quiet, sensing the change in the wind before the humans do. This is the period of high humidity, where the air feels thick and stagnant, pressing in from all sides until the world feels small and claustrophobic. Inside the mind, this pressure manifests as a narrowing of possibilities. The horizon of the future begins to pull inward until there is only the immediate, suffocating present. The storm front builds in silence, unnoticed by neighbors who see only the familiar brick facade of the home and the dormant grass of the lawn. They see a mother who is caring and nice, unaware that the internal clouds have reached a density that can no longer be sustained. And then, the lightning strikes. It is a single, devastating discharge of energy that changes the landscape in an instant. The strike is not the storm itself, but the result of the pressure that has been building for weeks or months. Once the lightning has fallen, the atmosphere breaks. The heavy, humid air is replaced by a cold, relentless rain, a downpour of grief and realization that washes over the ruins. This rain does not fix what has been broken, but it changes the temperature of the world. It brings a somber, gray clarity to the aftermath, a period where the wind finally dies down and the only sound left is the steady drip of water from the skeletal oak trees. The resolution of this case, as dictated by the court, is not one of immediate punishment, but of a mandated transition into care. The judge's denial of bond ensures that the physical boundaries of the jail and the hospital will remain in place, providing a forced stability where the internal weather can finally be monitored and managed. Andrea remains in the custody of the state, but she is also under the care of the medical system, a dual existence that reflects the complexity of the crisis. The legal path forward is marked by the date of March 3rd, a point on the calendar that represents the next step in a long, winding journey toward an ending that can never truly be called a conclusion. For the surviving child, the path is one of physical recovery. a slow mending of bone and tissue that will happen much faster than the mending of the family's spirit. He is the flickering light that Andrea Faust spoke of, a reason to keep moving forward through the gray rain of the Durham winter. As we reach the final moments of this narrative, the focus shifts away from the courtroom and the hospital, returning to the quiet streets of the suburb. The rain in North Carolina has a way of softening the edges of the world, turning the amber streetlights into glowing orbs and masking the sounds of the city. The dormant Bermuda grass drinks in the moisture, preparing for a spring that will eventually arrive, regardless of the tragedies that occurred during the winter. The skeletal oaks stand still, their gray branches dripping with water, holding the memory of the wind. There is a profound sense of closure in the stillness of the night, a recognition that the storm has passed and the air has finally cleared. The surviving brother is safe. The father is vigilant. The mother is being watched. The machinery of the world continues to turn, but for now, the pace has slowed to a crawl. You can feel the weight of the story lifting, leaving behind only the rhythmic sound of the rainfall and the steady hum of the night. The details of the case, the dates, the charges, and the pleas all begin to fade into the background, replaced by a sense of quietude. There is nothing more for you to analyze, no more facts to arrange in your mind. The landscape of Durham is tucked away under the darkness, and the silence of the suburb has returned to its natural state. It is a silence that allows for rest, a quiet that covers the houses and the trees like a soft, heavy blanket. The world is at peace, and the air is cool and still. The journey through this difficult narrative has reached its end, and the only thing left is the darkness and the comfort of your own surroundings. The rain continues its gentle work outside, washing over the red clay and the brick, bringing a sense of renewal to the tired earth. You are safe in the present, far removed from the storms of the past. The light is fading, the sounds are softening, and the night is yours. Let the rhythm of the rain guide you the rest of the way. Everything is settled. Everything is quiet. Sleep now. Good night.